A stranger opened her window at midnight. The Korean Mafia boss whispered, "You can't hide from me, little Rose. I found you." 23-year-old Rina sat in the quiet of her bedroom, unaware of what was about to happen. In 2 minutes, a man with silver-streaked hair would slide open her window and change her life forever. In 10 minutes, she'd be in a bulletproof sedan heading toward a fortress in Seoul. And the secret she'd been hiding for 2 years, the pendant her brother left behind, would either save her or destroy everything. The cool night air was suddenly heavy with the scent of expensive tobacco and rain. Do-Shin didn't climb through the window so much as he reclaimed the space within it, his rugged frame casting a shadow that swallowed Rina's small apartment. She stood frozen, the bedsheet she had scrambled to grab clutched white-knuckled against her chest, her wide eyes reflecting the calm, piercing steel of his gaze. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood there, a tall, middle-aged figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit, the streaks of gray in his hair silvered by the moon. "Your brother had a talent for hiding things, Rina," he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble that commanded the silence of the room. "But he was a fool to think he could hide from me." Before she could scream, the door to her hallway burst open. 4 massive men in black suits filed in with professional, cold expressions, their presence turning her sanctuary into a cage. Panic flared in her throat, but when she lunged for the door, a hand like iron closed around her wrist, spinning her back toward the window. "Don't," Do-Shin murmured, his thumb brushing almost gently against the racing pulse in her wrist. "The debt is yours now, little Rose. We're going home." 6 hours later, the neon skyline of Seoul blurred past the tinted windows of a silent sedan. Rina sat pressed against the leather door, her mind a fractured mess of grief and disbelief. They pulled into a sprawling estate, a fortress of glass and modern angles lit starkly against the dark hills. Inside the marble foyer, the air was chilled. Do-Shin turned to her, his expression unreadable as he tossed a slim folder onto a mahogany table. "You spent 3 years mourning a hero," he said, his ice-blue eyes stripping away her denial. "But David didn't die for his country. He was my accountant for 15 years, and before he disappeared, he stole $10 million and a priceless history from the Lee syndicate." Rina shook her head, her dark hair swaying wildly. "No, he was a good man. He left me that pendant to keep me safe." "He left you a target," Do-Shin corrected, stepping into her space until she could smell cedar and danger on his breath. "He was a double agent who traded your safety for his own exit. You aren't his legacy, Rina. You are his collateral." As the click of the heavy door locking echoed through the hall, Rina sank onto a velvet chair. Her brother hadn't saved her. He had sold her to the man who now stood watching her with a terrifying, predatory hunger. The sun had barely begun to crest over the Seoul skyline when the heavy oak door of Rina's room clicked open. A young woman with a sharp bob and a guarded expression entered, laying out a set of charcoal silk trousers and a matching blouse. "The boss is waiting in the conservatory," she said, her voice holding the same clipped professional edge Rina had come to expect in this house. Rina dressed with trembling hands, the high-quality fabric feeling like a second skin, a beautiful, expensive layer of armor. The conservatory was a vast, glass-walled wing of the estate, filled with the scent of lilies and the sharp, acidic tang of solvent. Do-Shin stood by a long, mahogany workbench, his jacket discarded, and his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. Before him lay a shattered celadon vase, its pale green fragments gleaming like broken emeralds. "My mother loved this piece," Do-Shin said, his gaze not leaving the wreckage. "It was the only thing she managed to keep when the syndicates tore our first home apart." He turned his piercing eyes to Rina, the dark suits of his guards flanking the doorway like shadows. "You have a reputation for making things whole again, Rina. Prove it." Rina approached the bench, her fingers instinctively reaching for the porcelain. As she began to clean the edges of the shards, the silence in the room shifted from oppressive to focused. Do-Shin didn't leave. He sat in a leather chair nearby, watching her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Over the next few days, their communication evolved into a language of shared silence and precise gestures. He would bring her a specific tea or adjust the lighting for her work without being asked. One afternoon, as she carefully applied gold lacquer to a seam, a technique meant to highlight the history of the break she felt him move behind her. "Why don't you hide the cracks?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "Because the break is part of its story," Rina whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hiding it would be a lie. It's stronger for having survived." Do-Shin reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw with a surprising, devastating gentleness. In that moment, the predator's mask slipped, and Rina realized she wasn't just restoring a vase. She was learning the map of a man who saw his own scars reflected in the art she healed. The following week, the air in the estate turned sharp and brittle, a premonition of the storm gathering within the syndicate. Rina was summoned to the grand study to polish a collection of antique snuff bottles, but as she worked in the shadows of the corner, the doors swung open. Lee Do-Shin entered, flanked not just by his usual guards, but by 4 men with weathered faces and eyes like flint, the lieutenants of the Lee Empire. Rina stayed small, her fingers gripping a silk cloth, as the room filled with the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective ambition. Do-Shin took his place behind the massive mahogany desk, his posture a study in quiet dominance. He didn't raise his voice as the men argued over territory and missing shipments. He simply leaned back, a cigarette unlit between his fingers, his calm, piercing eyes tracking each speaker with predatory precision. When the youngest lieutenant slammed a fist onto the desk, demanding a bloody retaliation against a rival sect, the room went deathly silent. Rina held her breath, watching the way Do-Shin's jaw tightened beneath his dark beard, the only sign of the fire burning beneath the ice. "Power isn't found in a pile of bodies," Do-Shin said, his voice a low, lethal murmur that cut through the tension like a blade. "It's found in the restraint that keeps those bodies standing until they are useful." He stood slowly, his rugged frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the map spread before them. He spoke of alliances, of the long game, and of the cost of a war that would leave their families in ashes. In that moment, Rina didn't see a monster. She saw a man carrying the crushing burden of 1,000 lives on his shoulders, a king who ruled through the sheer force of his will rather than the edge of a sword. The lieutenants bowed their heads, their defiance dissolving into absolute obedience. As the room emptied, the silence that remained was different, exhausted and heavy. Do-Shin didn't turn around. He stood staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling lights of Seoul. "You're still here," he noted, his voice stripping away the boss and leaving only the man. Rina stepped out from the shadows, her heart hammering. "You make it look easy, the control." "It's a cage, Rina," he replied, turning to look at her, the streaks of gray in his hair more prominent in the dim light. "One I built to keep the world out, but it keeps me in just the same." He stepped closer, his presence a physical force. "Your brother thought he could steal a piece of this cage. He had no idea how heavy the gold really is." The stillness of the estate was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, violent shift in the air. Rina was in the conservatory, her brush poised over a delicate lacquer repair, when the glass wall to her left exploded in a rain of crystalline shards. The shockwave threw her to the floor, the tang of ozone and gunpowder instantly replacing the sweet scent of lilies. Through the smoke, shadows moved, men in gray, lacking the polished restraint of Do-Shin's guards, their eyes wide with a frantic, desperate hunger. Rina scrambled backward, her silk blouse catching on the jagged remains of a workbench. Before the lead intruder could reach her, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the hall. Lee Do-Shin appeared like a specter born of the chaos. He didn't hesitate. His movements were a blur of lethal, rugged efficiency, a dark suit moving through the white haze of the fire suppressors. He met the first man with a blow that sounded like a falling tree, his calm, piercing eyes never losing their terrifying focus. "Get down," he roared, his voice a thunderous command that vibrated through the floorboards. Rina curled into a ball as the room became a symphony of shattered glass and muffled groans. A second attacker lunged at her from the side, a blade gleaming in the dim emergency lights. Before the metal could bite, Do-Shin was there. He stepped into the path of the weapon, catching the man's wrist in a grip that snapped bone with a sickening crack. He spun the attacker away as if he weighed nothing, shielding Rina's body with his own. The heat of him was overwhelming, the scent of expensive tobacco now laced with the metallic tang of blood, and the acrid sting of smoke. He pulled her up, his arm a solid, unyielding bar across her waist, and tucked her against his chest as he maneuvered toward the reinforced safe room. For the first time, Rina felt the raw power that lay beneath his quiet dominance. It was a savage, protective force that made the world outside seem like a churning sea of predators. Inside the steel-lined sanctuary, the chaos of the estate became a distant, muffled echo. Do-Shin leaned against the door, his chest heaving, a thin trail of blood tracing a path down his sharp jaw where a glass shard had grazed him. He looked at her, his gaze stripping away the boss and the monster until only the protector remained. Rina reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the dark fabric of his sleeve, damp with the sweat of the struggle. She realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that the man who had stolen her from her bed was the only thing standing between her and a world that would tear her apart. The cage he had built wasn't just to keep her in. It was the only place left where she could breathe. She was safer in the arms of the monster than in the hands of the men who called themselves free. The transition from the smoke-stained fortress of Seoul to the salt-slicked air of Jeju Island happened in a blur of luxury and lingering tension. The private jet hummed over the East China Sea, a sanctuary of cream leather and polished mahogany that felt obscene after the violence of the night before. Rina sat by the window, watching the volcanic peaks of the island rise from the blue expanse like the spine of a sleeping dragon. Across from her, Do-Shin had traded his dark wool suit for a charcoal linen shirt. The sleeves rolled back to reveal the rugged strength of his forearms, and a fresh bandage stark against his tanned skin. He didn't look like a man heading into a merger. He looked like a man finally allowing himself to breathe. His calm, piercing eyes followed the way the sunlight caught the dark waves of Rina's hair, his gaze heavy and assessing. "Jeju is a place for new beginnings, Rina," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the hum of the engines. "The air here is cleaner. It doesn't hold the scent of old debts." As they reached the sprawling coastal resort, the little Rose began to find her thorns. No longer wrapped in a bedsheet of fear, Rina moved through the marble halls in a dress of pale silk that shimmered like the inside of a seashell. Do-Shin's hand remained a constant, possessive weight on the small of her back, a touch that was both a shield and a claim. He didn't hide her away. Instead, he brought her to the center of the negotiations, his thumb brushing against her wrist in the quiet language they had built over shattered porcelain. Under his unwavering attention, Rina's posture shifted. She found herself meeting the eyes of the island's elite, her voice steady as she spoke of the value of history and the art of restoration. She saw the way other men looked at her, with curiosity and hunger, and the way Do-Shin's jaw tightened in response, his dominance radiating off him like heat. He watched her bloom with a pride that was dangerous and raw, his lips curving into a ghost of a smile whenever she held her ground. That evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the moonlit surf, the proximity was electric. "You're a quick study, little Rose," he whispered, leaning in until the scent of cedar and the sea enveloped her. Rina didn't flinch. She leaned into the warmth of him, realizing that in this world of predators, she wasn't just his guest or his collateral anymore. She was becoming his equal, a flower learning to thrive in the heart of a storm. The salt air of Jeju followed them into the private villa, but the atmosphere inside was heavy with the scent of old dust and regret. On a low table sat a small, lacquerwork jewelry box, its surface scarred by a jagged fissure that ran through a delicate inlay of mother-of-pearl. It was a humble piece compared to the celadon vases of Seoul, but as Rina set out her tools, she felt Do-Shin's presence behind her, more focused and somber than she had ever seen him. She worked in a rhythmic, meditative silence, her fingers moving with a precision that seemed to steady the air in the room. She didn't seek to erase the damage, but to honor it, filling the void with a blend of gold leaf and resin that shimmered like a healed wound. Do-Shin watched her from the shadows of a velvet armchair, his calm, piercing eyes fixed on the box as if it held the secrets of his own life. "That box belonged to my mother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that broke the silence. "The day it broke was the day the Lee syndicate nearly collapsed. It was the day I realized that loyalty is a currency few can actually afford." He stood and walked toward her, the moonlight catching the silver-streaked hair at his temples. He looked down at the box, then at Rina, his expression stripping away the mask of the boss. You asked once about the gray, he murmured, his hand lifting to touch the streaks of silver near his brow. Most people think it's the weight of the crown, but it happened in a single afternoon 3 years ago. He leaned closer, the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco enveloping her. The day your brother, David, walked out of my office with the syndicate's trust and $10 million was the day my world went cold. I didn't just lose money, Rina. I lost the only man I treated like a brother. The stress of that betrayal turned me into this man before the sun had even set. Rina's hand faltered for a moment, the gold leaf fluttering like a dying wing. She looked at the box, now whole but permanently changed, and then up at the man whose rugged face was a map of the very scars she was learning to heal. The betrayal wasn't just a story in a folder. It was etched into the very hair on his head and the quiet dominance in his gaze. "I am not my brother," she whispered, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "I know," Do-Shin replied, his thumb brushing her lower lip with a devastating, possessive gentleness. "That is why I haven't broken you, little Rose. I'm waiting to see if you can make me whole again." The grand hall of the Shilla Jeju was a sea of shimmering silk and cold ambition, lit by crystal chandeliers that cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the elite of the Korean underworld. Rina stood at Lee Do-Shin's side, her long dark hair swept up to reveal the delicate line of her neck, and the silver pendant that still felt like a weight against her skin. Do-Shin looked every bit the apex predator in a midnight black tuxedo, his hand resting possessively on her waist as he navigated the room with the quiet dominance that made men step back instinctively. The air shifted when they were approached by Chairman Kang, a man whose smile was as sharp and synthetic as a razor blade. Kang was Do-Shin's primary rival, a man who lacked Do-Shin's rugged restraint and replaced it with a loud, sneering arrogance. His eyes, small and greedy, crawled over Rina with a dismissive familiarity that made her stomach turn. "So this is the little flower everyone is talking about," Kang drawled, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. He leaned in, the scent of heavy cologne and cheap malice radiating from him. "Tell me, Do-Shin, does she know she's just a pretty bandage on a $10 million wound? Or is she just waiting for the day her brother's debt finally buries her?" The tension in Do-Shin's frame was immediate, a low vibration of lethal intent that Rina felt through his touch. His jaw tightened, and his calm, piercing eyes went flat and cold. But before he could speak, Rina stepped forward, breaking the protective circle of his arm. She met Kang's gaze without flinching, her posture no longer that of a victim caught in a bedsheet, but of a woman who had learned the art of restoration from the inside out. "Chairman Kang," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmurs of the gala. "In my work, I learned that the value of an object isn't in its pristine surface, but in its history, even the breaks. You see a debt. I see a man who has the strength to hold his world together while yours is built on the rot of others." She tilted her head, her honey-brown eyes flashing with a defiance that matched Do-Shin's own. "If you think I'm a captive, you haven't been paying attention. I'm the one who chooses what to make whole. And right now, all I see in front of me is a piece so fractured it isn't worth the gold to fix it." A stunned silence fell over the circle. Kang's face flushed a deep, ugly red, his mouth hanging open as he searched for a retort that wouldn't make him look small. Do-Shin didn't look at his rival. He looked at Rina, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of his mouth, his eyes narrowing with a look that was dangerously close to admiration. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles while his gaze never left hers. In that moment, the little rose hadn't just bloomed. She had grown thorns that drew blood, proving she was no longer a ghost of her brother's past, but a force in Do-Shin's present. The moon hung low over the Jeju coastline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the villa's balcony as Rina sat alone, the silver pendant clutched in her palm. The weight of it felt different tonight, heavier, more insistent, following the revelation of Do-Shin's silvered hair and the deep scars left by her brother's betrayal. She held the trinket up to the light, her eyes narrowing as she applied the same restorative focus she used on shattered porcelain. For 2 years, she had viewed the pendant as a keepsake of love, but in this world of predators and double agents, she finally looked at it through the lens of a restorative artist searching for a hidden seam. Her thumb traced the delicate filigree until it hit a microscopic catch along the side, a flaw so intentional it could only be a key. With a soft click, the back of the pendant swung open. It wasn't a photograph or a lock of hair inside, but a sliver of translucent film, etched with a string of microscopic coordinates and a digital key code. The air in her lungs felt thin as the truth settled into her bones. Her brother hadn't left her a target or a burden. He had left her the map to the $10 million and the stolen Lee artifact. The realization hit her like a physical blow, cold and staggering. She hadn't been an innocent bystander in this game of debt. She had been the vault all along. The very man who had protected her, who had looked at her with a hunger that bordered on reverence, was the man she had been unknowingly robbing every second she spent in his house. Her fingers trembled as she looked back toward the glass doors where Lee Do-Shin's shadow moved within the room. He was a man who valued loyalty above all else, a man who had admitted that betrayal turned his world cold. Now, Rina held the power to end the hunt and settle the debt that had bound them together since that midnight encounter at her window. But as she stared at the glowing coordinates, a terrifying question took root. Once the debt was paid, what would remain of the little Rose? Would she be free to walk away, or had she merely restored a bridge to a man who would never let her go? She tucked the film back into the silver casing, the secret burning against her skin like a brand, knowing that by morning, the truth would either save them both or reduce their fragile world to ashes. The dawn air in the villa's garden was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a fragile peace that felt at odds with the storm in Rina's chest. Lee Do-Shin stood by a stone lantern, his rugged frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He had discarded his jacket, and the white linen of his shirt seemed to glow, emphasizing the quiet dominance of his posture. As Rina approached, her bare feet silent on the manicured grass, he turned, his calm, piercing eyes tracking her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "The merger is finalized, Rina," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of a king concluding a campaign. "The Lee syndicate is whole again." He stepped closer, the streaks of gray in his hair catching the first light of morning. "I told you Jeju was for beginnings. I want you to stay, not as a guest and certainly not as collateral." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a devastating gentleness. "I want you by my side, my queen in a world that finally knows your name." Rina looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. The protection, the power, the heat of a man who looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. But as she felt the silver pendant heavy against her skin, she knew that a throne built on a lie was just another cage. "You offered me a choice once, Do-Shin," she whispered, her voice steady even as her eyes blurred with unshed tears. "You said I could choose my own path." She reached into the silk of her dress and pulled the pendant free, the metal gleaming in the sunlight. With a soft click, she opened the hidden seam and pressed the translucent film into his palm. "The coordinates to the 10 million and the artifact. My brother's debt is paid. In full." Do-Shin looked down at the film, his jaw tightening as the realization of her secret settled over him. The silence between them stretched, vibrating with the ghost of the betrayal he had carried for 3 years. He looked back at her, his gaze stripping her bare. "You've had this all along." "I found it last night," she lied softly, protecting the fragile bridge they had built. "I choose my freedom, Do-Shin. I can't be a queen in a cage, even one made of gold." A flash of raw pain crossed his rugged features, quickly masked by the cold authority of the boss. He closed his hand around the film, his knuckles turning white. "If you walk out of those gates, the protection of the Lee name goes with you. You'll be alone." "I've been alone in my brother's shadow for years," Rina replied, stepping back, her chin lifting with the defiance of a rose that had finally found its thorns. "Now I'm just Rina." She turned and walked toward the estate gates, her spine straight and her heart breaking with every step. She didn't look back to see him standing among the jasmine, a lonely king with a recovered fortune. She walked out into the light of a world that was vast and dangerous, finally free to restore her own life on her own terms.